As you can imagine, it wasn't an easy task to get these men to come up here and share their stories. It's not an easy thing to do. Our next presenter is going to talk about one of the hardest things to live with in prison, a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. This topic is very close to my heart because for the first 8 years of my incarceration, I had a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Although he is only one person, he speaks for many of us who have lived under the crushing weight of those 4 little letters, LWOP. Please welcome my friend, Art Longworth.
I made some notes, but before I show them to you, I'd like to tell you about Tony. Tony liked math. I saw him send away for math books and teach himself calculus and trigonometry in here. By himself. Somehow, don't ask me how, but he got other prisoners interested, and he taught them too. He always worked. Even after he lost part of his hand in the license plates factory, he went out and got another job right away. He ran a lot. If they let us into the yard for 3 hours, he'd spend every minute of it running. And he encouraged others to run. He bought things from the prison store like candy bars and coffee, toothpaste, soap, and he sponsored races in here that he didn't run in. I think so others would have a chance to win. Because if he had run, they wouldn't have. You ever know anyone like that? I can't help but feel that Tony was worth something. He cared about other people. And he lifted spirits in here many times. I knew him for as long as he was in prison, which was 25 years. Until he hung himself in his cell earlier this year. Tony had life without parole. He was one of about 50,000 men and women in this country who have that sentence. 50,000. In fact, I'm one too. I got it more than 30 years ago, not long after leaving the last state boys' home I grew up in. Although my face doesn't accurately represent this sentence, because 2/3 of those who have life without parole aren't white people. 66.4% nationally. 65% who have this sentence received it for a non-homicide offense, which I'm ashamed to admit isn't me either. But I do know this sentence, because it's impossible not to know it when it's been your experience for as long as you can remember. That's why I want to talk about life without parole. Honestly. Because inside these walls, it doesn't feel like people outside are doing that. Our legal system defines life without parole as non-capital. In other words, no different than any other prison term. So courts uphold life without parole in ways the US Supreme Court prohibited for capital punishment more than 40 years ago. This means that life without parole can be, and is in this state, handed out as a mandatory sentence that no judge or jury has any say over. And life without parole cases, they don't get the same kind of representation as cases the court does recognize as capital. It's not even close. A well-off shoplifter in this state can get better representation than a poor person facing a life without parole sentence. There's a lot wrong with that. But I think the root of the problem is the hypocrisy of a legal system that holds the actions of those it judges to a different standard than it holds its own. Now, I know that's hard to grab onto like that, but try to follow the line of thought. I think it's important. Courts assess culpability, or they weigh out the blameworthiness of an individual by viewing their crime through the lens of intent, right? Think about it. The intent of an individual committing a crime defines what the crime is. Often it's the difference between first degree or second degree or a different charge altogether. It's a fundamental principle of law. It doesn't make sense that a sentence issued by a court isn't viewed through the same lens. And when the intent behind a sentence changes from allowing for the possible reform of an individual to his or her death in prison, when that's specifically what you send someone to prison to do, to die here, how is that sentence not fully capital? Lawmakers have a different take on life without parole. In fact, it was politics that created this sentence. In 1972, state legislatures across the country enacted life without parole statutes. It was in response to a nationwide moratorium on the death penalty. Our state was no exception. Although life without parole was originally enacted only to be used for those who otherwise would have received the death penalty had it been in place at the time. However, once life without parole was on the books, lawmakers expanded its use through the idea that this sentence is a way to be tough. What's wrong with this is that sentencing so many people to life without parole without reviewing them at any point in their sentence isn't toughness. It's not tough. And I don't say that self-righteously, because I only learned it myself through the crime I committed as a young person. Not having compassion, not caring about any human being, no matter who they are, or how much you feel you're angry at them, or you think you hate them, or whatever. None of that's toughness. It's ignorance. Enmeshed in politics is the national campaign to abolish the death penalty. Although death penalty opponents seem to derive their understanding of life without parole from the courts, because they endorse this sentence as something less than execution. Their campaign promotes life without parole as a safe and just alternative, a mercy. Maybe death penalty opponents are misled by the term life. I assure you, if you shared this experience with us, you would know that life without parole is not life. In fact, that's exactly what it isn't. And promoting societal acceptance of life without parole legitimizes death in prison as a practice and has repercussions beyond this sentence. It supports all death in prison sentences. And frankly, it frames them as a condition that isn't so bad. Know that this kind of sentence is inhumane. It's torture in the eyes of the rest of the world. For that reason, the international campaign to abolish the death penalty doesn't support it. A campaign that does support it, even in the face of such racial disparity, grates against the history in this country behind the term abolition. The academic community, I think, comes the closest to understanding life without parole. Academics at least look at it objectively, right? They're the ones who coined the term warehousing to refer to prison as it is used nowadays. Packed full of people with long-term sentences with no serious system of reform or review. They describe life without parole as exclusion, albeit permanent. They analogize it with banishment. You've heard of that before, right? Banishment? It's a punishment from way back, from the old world. It predates incarceration. But academics don't quite have it right either. I mean, the term warehouse isn't accurate because a warehouse doesn't harm or destroy what it stores. It doesn't cause the product inside it to become less useful or compatible with society. This does. Neither is this mere exclusion. Prison in the US isn't a place where you go and merely do time. There's nothing passive about it. It's an active, aggressive form of punishment. Maybe you don't see this from outside. And maybe that's what the walls and fences around prison have come to be used for, to keep you from seeing that bad things happen to people in here as a matter of course. In reality, doing time is getting used to watching people be harmed and destroyed in front of you. We become hardened to it in here. I guess because we really don't have any other choice. We steel ourselves against it as a means of continuing to eke out our own existence. But that doesn't change what this is. No modern society has prisons as harmful as ours. And nothing is worse or more aggressive than being in here without hope. This isn't banishment. Let's be serious, okay? We didn't get stuck on a ship and sent to America. That's not what's going on here. So what is life without parole? Not what institutions or individuals outside the experience say it is, but what is it really? I can tell you that none of us who have this sentence got it for nothing. And because of that, because of the crime I committed, I'm not up here to advocate for or against this sentence. My intent is to relate it, to try to convey it to you, so you can decide for yourself whether or not you think a state institution should be doing this. Or at least if it should do it to so many people. The only way to even begin to understand life without parole is to imagine how you would feel if it were happening to you. You think you can do it? For anyone who's willing to try, let me describe for you what you would experience. Life without parole is hopelessness. You learn to survive, if you can, to exist. But it's only a holding on, a dogged refusal to quit. It's not because there's a path in front of you down which you might walk in order to redeem yourself. At no point in this sentence are you allowed in any way to make up for the crime you committed as a young person. No matter how vast the difference between who you were at the time of the offense and what you do or make of yourself in the decades after. Nothing is in front of you except the end point of the sentence. All you were really sent to prison to do, to die here. And with no point to work toward other than your own physical expiration, your will to live inverts. It turns in on itself. You feel as though you're being crushed, as though you can't draw in breath, as though you're only pretending to still be alive. Life without parole is the death penalty. And when it's happening to you, you realize that you don't have the same luxury as everyone else. The luxury of being able to pretend that that's not what this is.